This is Lincoln Sager, and these are my messy thoughts. I struggled a bit on how to start this. On the one hand, I've moved significantly away from the idea that my faith hasn't changed fundamentally in the last 3 years. But on the other, I don't want to stray into bombastic statements that might give the wrong impression about my faith walk or drive away those people I care about most who have not yet walked the path I have. So I'll say that my faith has metamorphosed, and let that suffice. Actually, that is a very good analogy for what has happened, because while my faith has fundamentally changed form and now points in a more biblical direction, it has not changed its character or its internal nature, any more than a butterfly is not the same animal the caterpillar was. The same animal that underwent the change is there afterward. So what has and hasn't changed? To start with, I still believe in the God who created all the things in the universe and the universe itself. I still believe in the atoning sacrifice God made on behalf of myself and all the rest of the people in the world. I still believe that I cannot earn my way into heaven, or God's good side, or out of hell, or anything else. Every good thing I do is like filthy rags when viewed objectively against the standard of perfection, God's Word. And I still believe that God passionately desires for everyone to be saved. But I realize now that before these last 3 years, I wasn't reading my Bible very carefully, or listening closely to what I did understand. In short, I was allowing others to influence me about what the Bible said, even when some of those things were in direct contradiction to what I read, what His Word says. While I was reading and thinking more than a lot of people do, I was still letting slick words convince me that what I read on the page wasn't the actual meaning of God's love letter to humanity. The Bible does not allow me to continue to believe a number of ideas I once held as truth. That since I am saved by grace, via the Lord's sacrifice, I no longer need to worry about the laws of the Old Testament. That celebrating Christmas and Easter, but not celebrating Sukkot or Shavuot, for example, pleases God. That I'm pleasing God by tithing 10% of my income, either gross or net. That I'm following the leading of the Spirit when I'm not following the way God said in print that I should be walking. Or that Sunday is the day of rest. I'm hoping that I can explore each of these ideas more deeply in future videos. But right now, I think it would be helpful to try to start from the beginning and talk about why I feel that I've been worshiping God incorrectly all my life. I want you to understand why I consider myself less and less a Christian and call myself instead a Wayfarer. The changes in my faith started when I started reading my Bible more carefully. The specific impetus for this came from the discussions I was having with my wife about her faith before we were married. Now, lest anyone make the mistake of thinking I started following my wife's beliefs because they were hers, let me disabuse you of that notion right away. That isn't what happened at all, and she'd tell you that emphatically if you asked her. No, while I did make some behavioral changes so that I would be in harmony with her, they weren't things I cared deeply about. For example, when I started courting my wife, I began to avoid foods that weren't kosher, simply out of respect for her. However, for more than a year after we got married, I continually told people that I felt no religious conviction that I ought to be eating kosher. It didn't matter to me if I ate shellfish or not. In my mind, food was food. Rather, I changed my belief slowly as I read more in the Bible and learned more about the Bible. It was not to match up to my wife, but to match up to the way. For I didn't change my beliefs and my behavior about things I thought mattered until I saw that I was not in line with God's Word. I made those important changes when I was convinced and convicted by the Bible. I made these changes because the Lord is my King. I'm hopeful that when you hear what I've learned and study these things for yourself, you'll want to change too. I know that many of you genuinely want to serve the Lord. I also know that most of you believe you are, just as I did. In which case, I believe you will want to know what is right and do it, even if it isn't what you're doing now. So eating kosher was probably the first change I made, but kosher was a measure of expedience at first. I didn't want to ask my wife to violate her convictions or have to prepare 2 meals, a kosher one for herself and a repugnant one for me. But the first thing I was actually convicted of was probably the Sabbath. All my life I thought Sunday was the day of rest. I thought God approved it, Paul defended it, and even beyond that, all days were alike, weren't they? I'd been told so, growing up, by pastors, shows, and books. Every Sunday was a tacit reinforcement of this, as we went to church and worshipped on the Lord's Day. And because our hearts were intent on serving God, that was good, wasn't it? Yes, it is good to have a good intention, and sincerely try to serve the Lord even in ignorance of His wishes. But I have to ask a question. If I bring my wife raspberries over and over when she has said repeatedly that she hates them and prefers strawberries, will she be pleased with me? So if I wouldn't give my wife something she's told me she doesn't like instead of what she's told me she does, would I do it to the Lord? Or does God not care how I worship as long as I'm sincere? A little after I got married, the church I was attending closed. I tried a couple of other churches, but my wife wasn't really interested in finding a new place to worship on Sunday. So we tried the synagogue nearest us and liked the way the place felt. After we started attending there, I started seeing a pattern in the scriptures that I was exposed to, and I started seeing that the Shabbat is important to God. He cares that we honor Him and His creation of the world as He did. And He said that Shabbat was an eternal ordinance in all locations. And if I wanted to worship on Sunday instead, wasn't I following the ones who changed it in our worship practice? And who changed the day we worship? Wasn't it the Roman Catholic Church? Wasn't I placing myself under the Pope instead of under the Lord by worshiping on Sunday and not observing the Shabbat? On February 5th, 1950, our Sunday visitor stated, "In observing the Sunday, Protestants are accepting the authority of the spokesman for the Church, the Pope." And Peter Kramer said in 1975 that the Roman Church had the authority to change the Old Testament rituals, including transferring the solemnity from the Sabbath to Sunday, and that there is no command or tradition in the Bible supporting the observance of Sunday. I never wanted to be a Catholic. I considered the veneration of Mary and the prayers to the saints to be idolatry, and I wanted no part of that. But wasn't it service to the Roman Church to follow their decrees in place of God's? As Polycrates said of another observance that was changed, I say now of Shabbat. Better people than I have said, we must obey God rather than men. Thanks to the generous support of my patrons on Patreon, My Messy Thoughts is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Derivative license. This means that you are free to redistribute this artistic work, even for money, but you are not allowed to change it in any way, and you must include this notice. If you enjoyed this work, consider supporting the creation of more like it at my Patreon page. Thank you.